On Saturday morning, March 15th, 2025, Bridget Carlton woke up with a feeling that something was wrong. She lay in bed at her home on Huntridge Avenue in the prestigious Topeka neighborhood, listening to her husband Eston showering in the adjacent bathroom. Tomorrow would be his 42nd birthday, and she should have been happy about the upcoming celebration. Instead, a heaviness settled in her chest, like a stone she couldn't swallow. The Carlton home was the embodiment of the American middle-class dream. The two-story brick building with a neat lawn and white shutters stood on a quiet street where neighbors knew each other by name. Inside, everything was immaculate. The cream walls of the living room were decorated with family photos in silver frames, and the dark wood kitchen was spotless. Bridget was proud of her home. She had put 15 years of marriage into it, choosing every detail with love and hope for the future. Now these walls seemed to her like the set of a play in which she and Eston played the roles of a happy couple. She couldn't say exactly when their marriage had turned into a one-man show. Perhaps it happened gradually, like paint being washed away by the rain, imperceptibly, day after day. Eston came out of the bathroom with a towel wrapped around his waist, drops of water glistening on his shoulders. At 41, he still looked attractive, tall, broad-shouldered, with attentive brown eyes that had once made her heart beat faster. His temples were graying, but that only added to his gravitas. He was the kind of man women noticed in restaurants or stores. "Good morning," he said, without even looking at her. His voice was even, as if he were talking to a colleague rather than his wife. "Morning," Bridget replied, watching him open the closet and take out a shirt. Even in such a simple action, there was a sense of detachment, as if there were an invisible wall between them. 15 years ago, they had met at a party thrown by mutual friends. Eston had just opened his restaurant, Carlton Grill, on Kansas Avenue, full of ambition and plans. Bridget worked as an assistant event coordinator at Topeka City Hall, dreaming of a career in event planning. They danced to slow music, and Eston whispered in her ear about his plans to turn the small restaurant into the best establishment in town. His enthusiasm was contagious, and his gaze was full of promise. Now, the Carlton Grill was indeed one of the most popular places in Topeka. The restaurant was located in a historic building in the city center, its interior combining classic American style with modern accents. On Friday and Saturday evenings, there weren't enough seats, and Eston's signature steak was even praised by critics from the Topeka Capital Journal. But success came at a high price. Bridget got out of bed and walked over to the window. Outside, March was showing its changeable nature. The sun was breaking through the gray clouds, and the trees were just beginning to bud. Kansas spring was always unpredictable, just like her own life lately. "I was thinking, maybe we could do something special tomorrow," she said without turning around. "Invite Mike and Jenny, Robert. It's been a while since we've all gotten together." Eston was buttoning his shirt, his movements automatic, honed by years of morning routine. "I don't know, Bridget. Tomorrow is Sunday and the restaurant will be busy. Maybe we should just have a quiet dinner at home." There was no enthusiasm in his voice. Eston used to love having guests, telling stories, being the center of attention. Now, he seemed to crave solitude, as if the company of old friends was a burden to him. Bridget finally turned around. "It's your birthday, Eston. 42 is an important milestone." He raised his head and looked at her for the first time that morning. Something flashed in his eyes: irritation, fatigue, or simply indifference. Important to whom? "I just want to spend the day in peace." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Bridget knew that behind this quietly lay a reluctance to pretend to be happy in the company of people who remembered them as young and in love. It was hard for her, too, to play the role of the contented wife when everything inside was falling apart. After breakfast, Eston left for the restaurant, as he had done every morning for the past 15 years. Bridget was left alone in the house, which seemed too big and too quiet. She sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tried to remember the last time she and her husband had had a real conversation. rather than exchanging pleasantries about the weather and household chores. Her job at City Hall took up most of her days. Over the course of 10 years, she had risen to the position of senior events coordinator and was now responsible for organizing all city festivals and ceremonies. The job required attention to detail, people skills, and the ability to turn ideas into reality. Bridget was good at her job, her colleagues respected her, and the mayor personally thanked her for the successful events. But even her professional achievements could not fill the growing void in her personal life. In the evenings, when Eston stayed out later and later at the restaurant, Bridget sat in the living room with a book or watched television, listening for the sound of his car in the driveway. When he finally came home, smelling of kitchen odors and exhaustion, they exchanged the ritual questions about their day. "How are you?" "Fine. How are you?" "Fine too." And that was it. They never had children. In the early years of their marriage, they were in no hurry, enjoying their youth and building their careers. Then there were several unsuccessful attempts, visits to doctors, tests that showed that both of them were fine, but pregnancy still did not happen. Gradually, the subject became painful, then taboo, and finally, they stopped talking about it altogether. The nursery in their house became Bridget's office. In recent months, Bridget had noticed changes in her husband's behavior. He had become more distracted, often checking his phone, even when they were having dinner together. His work schedule became even more unpredictable. Sometimes he would stay late until midnight. Other times he would suddenly be free in the middle of the day and disappear for several hours, explaining that he had meetings with suppliers or bankers. The Carlton Grill was going through difficult times. Bridget knew this, even though Eston rarely shared details about the business. The pandemic had hit the restaurant industry hard, and the recovery was slower than expected. Competition in Topeka had intensified. New, trendier, and cheaper establishments had opened. Eston was forced to take out loans to keep the business afloat, and Bridget could see the pressure reflected in his face and behavior. But financial problems did not explain his emotional detachment. In the past, when times were tough, they had been a team, supporting each other and discussing decisions together. Now Eston had withdrawn into himself, as if he had decided that she was incapable of understanding his problems or helping to solve them. That evening, Bridget tried again to bring up the birthday. They were sitting in the living room, she with a magazine, he with his laptop, reviewing the restaurant's financial reports. The TV was on in the background, showing the evening news. "Eston, I want your birthday to be special," she began. He looked up from the screen. "Bridget, we've already discussed this. I'm not in the mood for a party. Not a party. Just to celebrate. We could have a nice dinner somewhere or go away for the weekend. I don't have time for the weekend." His voice became sharper. "The restaurant is on the verge of bankruptcy, and you're suggesting entertainment." The word bankruptcy fell between them like a stone. Bridget knew things were bad, but not that bad. "Why didn't you tell me?" "We could have come up with something. I could have." "What could you do?" he interrupted. "You don't understand how business works. It's not like organizing city festivals." His words hurt her deeply. In 10 years of working at City Hall, she had learned to manage budgets, plan events for thousands of people, and resolve crises. But that didn't matter to Eston. "I'm sorry," he said more quietly, noticing the look on her face. "I'm just tired. Let's have dinner at home tomorrow, and you can bake a cake. That will be enough." Bridget nodded, but her chest remained heavy. She understood that the problem was not just the restaurant or the money. Something fundamental had changed in their relationship, and she didn't know how to fix it. That night, she lay awake for a long time, listening to her husband's steady breathing beside her. He slept peacefully, but even in his sleep, there was a distance between them. They used to fall asleep in each other's arms, but now they each kept to their own side of the bed. On that Sunday morning, while Bridget was reflecting on the state of her marriage, Rachel Morgan stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom on Fairloon Street, carefully choosing an outfit. Tomorrow was Eston's birthday, and she planned to surprise him with something that could change their relationship forever. Rachel lived in a modern townhouse in a new residential complex on the west side of Topeka. It was an area populated by young professionals and divorcees starting over. Her home was stylishly furnished, minimalist furniture, neutral tones, expensive accessories. Everything looked like something out of an interior design magazine, but it lacked the warmth and livability that comes with years of living together. 8 months ago, Rachel had no idea that her life would change dramatically because of a routine business meeting. She worked as a real estate agent at Prairie Realty, one of the largest companies in Topeka, specializing in commercial real estate. Her client was Eston Carlton, who was considering expanding his restaurant business and was looking for a location for a second establishment. They met in her office on a rainy July morning. Eston arrived right on time, wearing a dark suit that accentuated his athletic build. Rachel immediately noticed his hands, strong, neatly manicured, and without a wedding ring. She later learned that he took it off while working in the kitchen, but at the time it seemed like a sign to her. Eston was a serious client with a clear idea of what he wanted. He was looking for a space between 200 and 300 square meters in the central part of the city, preferably in a historic building, with the possibility of remodeling it into a restaurant. The budget was limited, but realistic for Topeka. Rachel showed him 7 properties in 2 weeks. They spent several hours together discussing layouts, infrastructure, and the potential profitability of the locations. Eston talked about his restaurant, about how important it was to create an atmosphere that would make people want to come back. His passion for his work was contagious, and his professional knowledge was impressive. "A restaurant isn't just a place where food is prepared," he said, standing in the empty space of a former bank on Kansas Avenue. "It's a story you tell every guest. The interior, the music, the smells, even the way the bill is presented. Everything has to work toward that story." Rachel listened, watching him gesticulate as he explained his ideas. There was such enthusiasm in his voice that she found herself forgetting the business side of the meeting and simply enjoying his company. In the end, Eston decided not to buy the second location. Financial analysis showed that the expansion would be too risky in the current economic climate. Rachel was disappointed not only by the lost commission, but also by the fact that their regular meetings had come to an end. However, Eston called her a week later and invited her to lunch at the Carlton Grill. "I want to thank you for your professional work," he said, "and show you what I do best." The lunch lasted almost 3 hours. Eston personally prepared the restaurant's signature dish for her, ribeye steak with truffle oil and a side of grilled vegetables. The food was excellent, but Rachel enjoyed the conversation even more. Eston talked about his journey in the restaurant business, starting as a dishwasher as a teenager and ending with opening his own establishment. She shared her experience of divorce and her decision to radically change careers, moving from marketing to real estate. That's when he first mentioned his wife. In passing, as if in passing, talking about the difficulties of the restaurant business. "Bridget thinks I work too much," he said, stirring his coffee. "She's probably right." Rachel felt a pang of disappointment, but she didn't show it. She was a grown woman who had been through a divorce and knew that being attracted to a married man would lead to nothing good. But something in the tone of his voice when he said his wife's name made her sit up and take notice. There was no warmth, no love, just a statement of fact. After that lunch, they began seeing each other regularly. At first, it was business coffee. Eston was consulting on the valuation of his restaurant for negotiations with the bank about loan restructuring. Rachel helped him understand market prices for commercial real estate in downtown Topeka. Gradually, their meetings became more personal. They dined in quiet restaurants on the outskirts of town, walked in Gage Park, and drove to Lake Shawnee on weekends. Eston talked about his disappointment in his marriage, how he and Bridget had become strangers living in the same house. Rachel listened, knowing she was crossing a dangerous line, but unable to stop herself. Their first kiss happened in September, after a particularly difficult day at the restaurant. Eston called her late in the evening, upset about a conflict with a supplier who was threatening to stop deliveries due to overdue payments. Rachel came to his restaurant after closing, brought a bottle of wine, and just listened. When he leaned over to thank her, the distance between them disappeared. From that moment on, their relationship entered a new phase. Eston came to her house 2 or 3 times a week, usually in the afternoon, between breakfast and the evening shift at the restaurant. They made love with the desperation of people who know their time is limited. After intimacy, they would lie in bed, and Eston would talk about his plans and dreams, about the restaurant he wanted to open someday on the coast. Rachel fell deeper and deeper in love. At 35, after a painful divorce from her alcoholic husband, she thought she would never be able to trust a man again. Eston was different, attentive, passionate, intelligent. He remembered the small details of their conversations, brought her favorite flowers, listened when she talked about problems at work, but he never talked about the future of their relationship. When Rachel cautiously brought up the subject of what would happen next, Eston became evasive. "Now is not the time to make big decisions," he said. "There are too many problems with the restaurant." Rachel understood his position intellectually, but emotionally, it was becoming increasingly difficult for her to cope with the uncertainty. She wanted more than secret meetings on weekdays. She wanted to wake up next to him, plan weekends together, introduce him to her friends. She wanted a real relationship, not a romance in the shadow of someone else's marriage. In recent weeks, the tension between them had been growing. Eston had become increasingly secretive, often canceling meetings at the last minute, citing problems at the restaurant. Rachel suspected that he was struggling with guilt and trying to distance himself from her. That's why she decided to surprise him for his birthday. Rachel bought an expensive gift, vintage cufflinks from the 1940s that she saw in an antique shop in the city center. Eston collected vintage accessories and often talked about how important details were in creating the image of a successful restaurateur. But the gift was just an excuse. In fact, Rachel planned to give him an ultimatum that evening. 8 months of a secret relationship was enough. She wanted to know if Eston was ready to leave his wife for her, or if their romance was doomed to remain a fleeting infatuation. Rachel understood the risks. Appearing at the Cartons' house meant the end of secrecy, confrontation with Eston's wife, and a possible scandal in the small community of Topeka. But she could no longer live in limbo, not knowing if their relationship had a future. On Sunday evening, she called Eston. "Tomorrow is your birthday. I want to wish you a happy birthday." "Rachel, we've talked about this. I'm having a family dinner." "I know. I'll come later after the guests have left. I have a gift for you." There was silence on the line. Rachel could hear him breathing, imagining his face, surprise, concern, maybe anger. "That's a bad idea," he finally said. "Maybe, but I'm coming anyway." At 9 o'clock, she hung up before he could argue. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. The decision was made, and there was no turning back. On Monday afternoon, Rachel could hardly concentrate on her work. She was showing an apartment to a young couple, but her thoughts were preoccupied with the upcoming evening. What would she say to Eston? How would he react? What would happen if his wife was home? By evening, her nervousness had turned to determination. Rachel took a bath, carefully styled her hair, and chose an elegant black dress, not too provocative, but one that flattered her figure. She wanted to look dignified, like a woman who knew her worth. The gift lay in a small velvet box in her purse. The cufflinks cost more than she could afford, but it was an investment in their future. If Eston chose her, the money wouldn't matter. If not, well, at least she would know the truth. On the way to the Carltons' house, Rachel rehearsed her speech. She would tell Eston how she felt, explain that she could no longer live in the shadows. She would give him time to think, but not too much. She deserved certainty. She deserved to be someone's priority, not a secret. The house on Huntridge Avenue was lit with warm yellow light. Rachel parked across the street and watched the windows for a few minutes. Silhouettes moved behind the curtains. Eston and his wife, living their lives in the house that had been their home for 15 years. A pang of jealousy mixed with regret stabbed her in the chest. Rachel knew she was destroying someone's family, but she couldn't stop. Love was stronger than morality, passion stronger than reason. She checked the time on her phone. 9 o'clock sharp. It was time to walk to the door and change her life forever. Monday, March 16th, 2025, began with a gray and rainy morning. Bridget woke up at 6:30 as usual, but the bed next to her was empty. The sounds from the kitchen suggested that Eston was already up and making himself coffee. On his 42nd birthday, he behaved as detached as he did on any other day. Going down to the kitchen, Bridget found her husband at the table with a cup of coffee and his phone in his hands. He was scrolling through something on the screen, completely absorbed in the digital world. Unopened mail lay on the table, among which she noticed several envelopes with bank logos, probably reminders of overdue payments. "Happy birthday," she said softly, approaching him from behind and placing her hand on his shoulder. Eston flinched as if he had forgotten she existed and quickly turned off his phone screen. "Thanks," he replied, but didn't even turn around to look at her. Bridget noticed his reaction to her touching his phone. Before, Eston had calmly left the device on the table, ignoring incoming messages during their conversations. Now he guarded it like a state secret, always keeping the screen down and quickly putting it away if she got too close. "I was thinking, maybe you could leave the restaurant early today," she suggested, pouring herself some coffee. "We could have dinner at home, and I'll make your favorite dish." Eston looked up and looked at her for the first time that morning. Something flashed in his eyes, irritation or impatience. "I have a meeting with a supplier at 7 o'clock. Important negotiations on prices." A lie. Bridget sensed it intuitively, though she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the way he avoided her gaze or his overly quick response, as if he had prepared his explanation in advance. "On my birthday? Can't it wait?" "Business doesn't wait for birthdays, Bridget. You know how tough things are with the restaurant right now." Eston finished his coffee and got up from the table, clearly wanting to end the conversation. He kissed her on the forehead, a formal, cold kiss that felt more like an automatic gesture than a sign of intimacy. After he left, Bridget was left alone with a heavy feeling in her chest. Her husband's birthday, which was supposed to be special, had turned into just another ordinary day of alienation and unspoken words. She cleared away breakfast, wondering when their relationship had become so formal. At City Hall, the workday proceeded at its usual pace of meetings and planning for upcoming city events. Bridget coordinated preparations for Earth Day in April, but her thoughts kept returning to Eston. Her co-workers congratulated her on her husband's birthday and asked about her plans for the evening, and each time she had to come up with something about a quiet family dinner. At lunchtime, she decided to surprise Eston and stopped by the Carlton Grill with a cake she had ordered from Sweet Dreams Bakery on Topeka Boulevard. It was a tradition from the early years of their marriage. Unexpected visits to each other's workplaces, small romantic gestures that kept them close. The restaurant was full of customers at lunchtime, which was a good sign for business. Waitresses bustled between tables, and the familiar sounds of work could be heard from the kitchen. Bridget walked to the front desk, where she was greeted by Carol, the floor manager who had been working for Eston for 7 years. "Hi, Bridget." What a surprise. Eston is in his office, sorting through deliveries. Eston's office was on the second floor, above the main dining room. Bridget climbed the narrow staircase, carrying the box of cake. The office door was ajar, and she could hear her husband's voice as he talked on the phone. "You can't come today." "I'm serious, Rachel. It's too risky." Bridget froze on the stairs. The name Rachel sounded so intimate that it took her breath away. Eston's voice was soft, almost pleading, the way he used to talk to her. "I understand you're upset, but you have to wait." "No, I'm not avoiding the conversation. Listen, let's talk tomorrow, okay?" Silence. then a heavy sigh. Bridget turned and quietly descended the stairs, clutching the cake box to her chest. Her heart was beating so hard that she was afraid it could be heard in the noisy restaurant. Carol looked at her in surprise. "What's wrong? Didn't you go to Eston?" "He's busy with an important phone call." "Will you give him the cake? Tell him I stopped by to say congratulations." Bridget left the restaurant feeling like her world was falling apart. The name Rachel echoed in her head like an alarm bell. Who was this woman? Why did Eston speak to her in that tone? And why couldn't she come today? Was it too risky? The rest of the workday passed in a fog. Bridget tried to focus on the documents, but the letters blurred before her eyes. She couldn't believe what she suspected, but all the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together into a terrifying picture. Late nights, constant phone checks, emotional detachment, unwillingness to spend time together. Now the mysterious Rachel, who couldn't come today because it was too risky. That evening, Bridget arrived home at 6:30 and started cooking dinner, even though she didn't know when Eston would be back. She fried his favorite fish, salmon with herbs, hoping that a family dinner would help them finally have a heart-to-heart talk. Maybe she had misunderstood the phone call. Maybe Rachel was a business partner or colleague. Eston returned at 8:30, looking tired and tense. He barely touched his dinner, answered her questions about his day distractedly, and checked his phone several times during the meal. "How was the meeting with the supplier?" Bridget asked, watching his face. Eston looked up from his plate. For a moment, there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes, as if he had forgotten his own lie. "Fine. We agreed on a discount for the meat. Good. So there's progress with the restaurant's finances." "Yes, gradually." They ate in silence, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Bridget wanted to ask about Rachel, but couldn't bring herself to do it. Her fear of hearing the truth was stronger than her desire to know it. After dinner, Eston went to the living room to watch the news, while Bridget cleaned up the kitchen. As she washed the dishes, her husband's phone, lying on the kitchen table, vibrated with an incoming message. Eston was in the living room, engrossed in the TV. Bridget looked at the screen. The message was from a contact named RM. "I'm coming anyway. At 9 p.m., I have a gift for you." Bridget's hands trembled as she placed the plate in the dish rack. The time was 8:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, the mysterious Rachel was coming to their house with a gift for her husband. Bridget's world began to crumble. 15 years of marriage, shared plans, hopes for the future, all of it shattered by a simple message on her phone. Eston was cheating on her. He was having an affair, and his mistress was so bold as to show up at their family home. Bridget went into the living room, where Eston was sitting in an armchair, flipping through channels. He seemed calm, but she noticed him glancing at his watch every now and then. "Your phone," she said, handing him the device. Eston took the phone and looked at the screen. Bridget saw his expression change, first surprise, then anxiety, then something like panic. "Who is RM?" she asked quietly. Eston looked up. His eyes reflected guilt and fear. "Bridget, I can explain. Who is RM, who is coming here in 10 minutes with a gift for you?" The silence lasted an eternity. Eston opened and closed his mouth like a fish thrown ashore. His face turned pale, and he clutched the phone convulsively in his hands. "It's not what you think," he finally said. "What do I think, Eston?" "Tell me what I think. Bridget, listen." The doorbell interrupted him. The sharp, insistent sound cut through the silence of the living room like a knife. The couple looked at each other, and that look said it all: guilt, fear, despair. Bridget got up from the sofa. "Is it her?" Eston nodded, unable to speak. The second ring was longer, more insistent. Whoever was standing at the door was not going to leave. Bridget walked to the front door as if in a dream. Every step was accompanied by a pain in her chest. Behind that door stood the woman who had destroyed her marriage, who had taken her husband away from her, who was brazen enough to come to her house. She opened the door. On the threshold stood a beautiful woman of about 35, with shoulder-length brown hair and bright green eyes. She was dressed in an elegant black dress and held a small box wrapped in expensive paper in her hands. Her face wore an expression of determination, which changed to surprise when she saw Bridget. "You must be Bridget," the woman said quietly. "I'm Rachel Morgan." The name sounded like a slap in the face. Bridget looked at the woman who had slept with her husband, who knew his intimate secrets, who had received from him the tenderness and attention that she herself had been deprived of for months. "Rachel," Bridget repeated, tasting the name. It was bitter. She heard footsteps behind her. Eston appeared in the hallway, his face whiter than paper. "Rachel, you shouldn't have come." Rachel looked at him over Bridget's shoulder. "I said I would come." "We have things to talk about, not here, not now, then when?" Rachel's voice grew louder, filled with despair and frustration. "When, Eston?" "I've been waiting 8 months." Bridget felt the ground slip away beneath her feet. 8 months. While she was planning their future, trying to save their marriage, worrying about the restaurant's financial problems, her husband had been seeing another woman for 8 months. "Come in," Bridget said coldly. "Looks like we all have something to talk about." Rachel hesitated on the threshold, clearly not expecting such an invitation. Eston took a step forward. "Bridget, don't!" "Come in," Bridget repeated louder, looking straight into her husband's mistress's eyes. "I want to hear what you wanted to say to my husband on his birthday." Rachel entered the house, holding the gift in front of her like a shield. Silence reigned in the hallway, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The 3 people stood in a triangle, each knowing that the next few minutes would change their lives forever. A tense silence reigned in the living room of the house on Huntridge Avenue. 3 people stood in an awkward triangle, Bridget by the sofa, Eston by the entrance to the hallway, Rachel closer to the window, still clutching the gift box. 8 months, Bridget repeated, her voice devoid of emotion. Shock had frozen all her feelings, leaving only cold clarity. "So it started back in the summer." Rachel looked at Eston, expecting him to say something, but he stood silently, like a statue. His face was gray, his eyes darting between the 2 women. "I didn't plan for this to happen," Rachel said quietly. "We just found each other." "Found each other," Bridget sneered, but her laughter sounded like glass. "How romantic." "And where exactly did you find each other?" "In my bed." "Bridget, please," Eston began. "Shut up." Her voice was like the crack of a whip. "I want to hear it from her. Tell me, Rachel, how you found my husband for 8 months." Rachel straightened up, and something defiant appeared in her posture. "We met at my house. During the day when you were at work. When you were..." Each word was like a slap in the face. Bridget imagined them together, in a strange bed, while she sat in her office at City Hall planning city events, while she worried about the restaurant's finances and tried to support her husband through a difficult time. "And what did you want to say to him today?" Bridget asked. "What gift did you bring?" Rachel looked at the box in her hands, then at Eston. "I wanted to know when he would tell you the truth. When he would make his choice." "Choice?" Bridget laughed, and that laugh was worse than a scream. "Do you think he'll choose you? A woman who comes into someone else's house and demands someone else's husband?" "I love him," Rachel said, and there was pain in her voice. "And he loves me." "Tell her, Eston. Tell her the truth." All eyes turned to Eston. He stood leaning against the wall, looking like a man caught in a trap. Sweat glistened on his forehead, his breathing was ragged. "Eston," Bridget called, "do you love her?" The silence lasted an eternity. The silence was the answer. "I don't know," he finally said. "It's too complicated." "You don't know?" Rachel took a step toward him, forgetting Bridget's presence. 8 months, and you don't know? All the things we said to each other, all the plans. What plans? Bridget interrupted. What did you talk about in bed? Rachel turned to her, anger flashing in her eyes. About the future you don't have with him. About how he's suffocating in this marriage, how you've turned into a roommate. Rachel, don't, Eston warned. No, let her know. Rachel was beside herself, all the emotions she had been holding back for months bursting out. Let her know that he told me about your cold dinners, about how you sleep in the same bed but live like strangers. Every word hit home. Bridget felt not only her marriage crumbling, but her entire self-image. So Eston had been discussing their intimate life with his mistress, complaining about her, portraying her as cold and uninteresting. Enough, Bridget said quietly. He said you're like brother and sister, that you haven't been intimate in over a year. Enough. That he feels trapped, that you... I said enough. Bridget's scream filled the room. Eston flinched. Rachel took a step back. In the ensuing silence, only heavy breathing could be heard. Leave, Bridget said in an icy voice. Leave my house. No. Rachel straightened up. I won't leave until Eston tells me the truth. Until he makes a choice. The choice has been made. Bridget looked at her husband. Tell her, Eston. Tell her what you choose. Eston was silent, and that silence was worse than any words. Tell her, Bridget shouted. I need time to think, he muttered. Rachel laughed bitterly. Time? How much more time do you need? A year? 2? Until I grow old, waiting for your decision? Rachel, please understand. No, you understand! She took a step toward him, waving the gift box. I'm sacrificing everything for you. I fell in love with a married man, destroyed my own principles, and live in constant uncertainty. The box fell from her hands and hit the floor. The lid opened, and vintage cufflinks spilled out onto the carpet. Shiny, expensive, chosen with love. Bridget looked at the cufflinks, then at Rachel, then at her husband. Something inside her broke completely. Not just her heart, something deeper, more fundamental. 15 years of her life, dreams of the future, her image of herself as a beloved wife, all of it crumbled like a house of cards. How much did they cost? She asked quietly. What? Rachel didn't understand. The cufflinks. How much did they cost? I paid $1,200. $1,200. More than Bridget spent on clothes in 6 months. More than their monthly mortgage payment. His mistress bought her husband gifts that were more expensive than she could afford for herself. Expensive, Bridget said and walked over to the fireplace. On the mantelpiece were their family photos, commemorative gifts, souvenirs from trips they had taken together, and a heavy bronze candlestick, a wedding gift from Eston's parents 15 years ago. Rachel continued to speak, her voice becoming increasingly hysterical. Do you think money matters? I'm willing to give him more than you ever could. I'm willing. Bridget picked up the candlestick. It was heavy, cold, solid, like their marriage once was, like their home, like her life before this evening. I'm ready to be with him for real, not just play happy family. Something red blocked Bridget's vision. 15 years of humiliation, months of suspicion, today's revelations, all merged into a single wave of rage. Rachel stood with her back to her, waving her arms, explaining something to Eston about love and choice. She didn't see Bridget approaching from behind with a candlestick in her hands. And if you think you can just play with my feelings... The blow landed on the back of her head. A dull, powerful sound, like a hammer hitting wood. Rachel sank to her knees, not understanding what had happened. Blood began to ooze from the wound on her head. My God! Eston cried. Rachel tried to turn around to lift her head, but her coordination was impaired. She saw Bridget through a haze, not understanding where the pain was coming from. Bridget, what are you doing? The second blow was harder than the first. Rachel fell face down, her body twitched several times and then went still. Blood spread across the light-colored carpet in a dark stain. Bridget stood over the body, breathing heavily, still clutching the candlestick. Her white blouse was splattered with blood, her hands trembling. "You killed her," Eston whispered. "My God, you killed her." Bridget looked at him, her eyes empty. "She destroyed our family." "Bridget," Eston backed away toward the phone. "I need to call an ambulance." "Don't." Her voice was strangely calm. "It's too late." Eston grabbed the phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. "911, what is your emergency?" "My wife. She's a dead woman here. I need an ambulance and the police. Sir, stay calm. Give me your address. 3247 Huntridge Avenue, Topeka." "Help is on the way. Stay where you are." Eston hung up and looked at his wife. Bridget sat in a chair, still holding the candlestick. She stared at Rachel's body without emotion, as if it were a broken vase. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "She came to my house," Bridget replied quietly. "On your birthday. She demanded that you choose her over me." Sirens could already be heard in the distance, approaching their quiet street. Neighbors would start looking out their windows, and tomorrow all of Topeka would be talking about what had happened at the Carlton house. The ambulance arrived first. The paramedics rushed into the house and immediately realized they were too late. One of them checked Rachel's pulse and shook his head. The other tried to help, but it was obvious that the woman was dead. The police arrived 3 minutes later. Sergeant Jimmy Thompson, whom Bridget knew from her work at City Hall, walked into the living room and stopped when he saw the scene. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. The two officers quickly assessed the situation. Bridget was sitting in an armchair with a blood-stained candlestick in her hands. Eston was standing by the wall, pale as a sheet. The young woman's body lay on the floor in a pool of blood. "Ma'am, put that down on the floor," said the young officer, pointing to the candlestick. Bridget obediently lowered the weapon onto the carpet. "I'm Detective O'Connor," said the middle-aged man as he entered the room. Michael O'Connor had been working in the homicide division for 20 years and had seen it all, but domestic dramas were always particularly painful. O'Connor was of medium height, stocky build, with graying hair and tired eyes. He wore a brown coat and well-worn boots, and spoke slowly and deliberately. His colleagues respected him for his thoroughness and ability to see details that others missed. "Who can tell me what happened here?" he asked, taking out his notebook. Eston opened his mouth, but Bridget beat him to it. "I killed her," she said simply. "She came to my house and said she'd been sleeping with my husband for 8 months. She demanded that he choose her over me," O'Connor wrote, his eyes never leaving his notebook. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Bridget Carlton." "And the victim?" "Rachel Morgan," Eston replied hoarsely. "Do you confirm your wife's statement, Mr. Carlton?" Eston nodded. "We were having an affair. Rachel came over today to wish me a happy birthday, and we got into an argument. Where is the murder weapon?" Bridget pointed to a candlestick. It was a wedding gift from his parents. O'Connor crouched down next to the body, touching nothing. There were 2 wounds on the victim's head and a lot of blood, but no signs of a struggle. Rachel had fallen face down, which meant the attack had come from behind. "Mrs. Carlton, you understand you have the right to an attorney." "I understand. But I have nothing to hide. I acted in the heat of the moment." "In the heat of the moment?" Bridget looked at Rachel's body, then at her husband. "She destroyed my family. 15 years of marriage. She came to my house with expensive gifts for my husband and demanded that he leave me for her." O'Connor continued to take notes. The story seemed simple, a classic drama of jealousy. A wife learns of her husband's affair, the mistress comes to the family home, a confrontation ensues, and the result is tragic. "Mr. Carlton, do you confirm that your wife acted in a state of passion?" Eston looked at Bridget. There was no remorse in her eyes, only fatigue. "Yes, she was beside herself with rage. The technicians had already begun working at the crime scene, photographing everything from different angles, collecting blood samples and packing up evidence. The house that had seemed a symbol of prosperity that morning had turned into a crime scene. "Mrs. Carlton, I'm afraid I have to arrest you," O'Connor said. "You have the right to remain silent." Bridget listened to her rights being read, staring at the bloodstain on the carpet. Tomorrow she would spend the night in jail, then court, possibly years behind bars. But strangely, she felt relief rather than fear. The secret was out, the lies were over, the decision had been made. The investigation into Rachel Morgan's murder took Detective Michael O'Connor 3 weeks, even though the basic facts had been clear from day one. Bridget Carlton's confession, her husband's testimony, the physical evidence at the crime scene, everything pointed to a simple case of murder motivated by jealousy. But O'Connor was too experienced an investigator to rely solely on the obvious. The autopsy revealed that Rachel Morgan died from a traumatic brain injury sustained from 2 blows with a blunt object. The first blow was to the back of the head and caused a concussion, while the second was to the parietal region and was the cause of death. The medical examiner determined that between 30 seconds and a minute had passed between the blows, which ruled out the possibility of accidental death during a struggle. Bridget's fingerprints were found on the candlestick handle, and blood spatters on her clothes matched the trajectory of the blows. The examination showed that the victim was killed from behind and did not expect the attack. There were no defensive wounds on Rachel's hands and forearms. O'Connor conducted detailed interviews with both parties. Eston Carlton confirmed his 8-month affair with the victim, talked about the restaurant's financial problems and the cooling of his marriage. He described Rachel as an intelligent, successful woman who had fallen in love with him and wanted a serious relationship. "I didn't plan it," Eston said during questioning at the police station. "It just happened." Rachel was understanding. She listened to my problems and supported me. Bridget and I became like neighbors. The detective found out that in recent months, Eston had been trying to distance himself from his mistress, realizing that the relationship had no future. Rachel, on the other hand, demanded certainty and threatened to tell his wife about the affair if he didn't make a decision. The victim's brother, Thomas Morgan, described his sister as a determined woman who was struggling with her divorce and seeking stability in a new relationship. She said she had found the right man, he told O'Connor, that he was unhappy in his marriage and would soon be free. "I warned her about the dangers of having an affair with a married man." Rachel's colleagues at the real estate agency confirmed that she had been tense and distracted in recent months, often receiving personal calls during working hours. One of her co-workers recalled Rachel buying expensive cufflinks and saying they were a gift for someone special. Bridget was held in Shawnee County Jail without bail. Her lawyer, David Harris, an experienced defense attorney from Topeka, built his defense around temporary insanity. A psychological evaluation showed that Bridget suffered from depression and feelings of inadequacy, exacerbated by problems in her marriage. "My client had been happily married for 15 years, Harris explained. The discovery of her husband's infidelity and the appearance of his mistress in the family home on his birthday came as a psychological shock to her. The trial began on May 15, 2025, in Shawnee County District Court. Prosecutor James Wilson sought a second-degree murder conviction, pointing to the premeditation of the second blow. The defense insisted on a charge of manslaughter in the heat of passion. Eston Carlton was the key witness for the prosecution. Appearing in court, he looked 10 years older. The restaurant had closed after his wife's arrest. His financial problems had worsened, and his friends and acquaintances avoided him. "I am to blame for what happened," he admitted to the jury. "If I had been honest with my wife from the beginning, Rachel would still be alive." But Bridget did not plan the murder. She acted in a moment of desperation. Eston's testimony made a strong impression on the jury. A man who lost both his wife and his mistress because of his own deception evoked sympathy rather than condemnation. Thomas Morgan made a statement on behalf of the victim's family. Rachel was a kind, intelligent woman who deserved love and happiness. Her death is a tragedy for all of us, but we understand that Bridget Carlton is also a victim of circumstances. Expert psychiatrist Dr. Susan Mitchell explained the mechanism of affective state to the jury. Mrs. Carlton experienced acute stress from the destruction of her basic beliefs about her life. The appearance of a rival in the house, the demands of choice, the details of her husband's intimacy with another woman, all of this created an explosive situation. Bridget herself conducted herself with dignity in court. She did not try to justify herself or elicit sympathy, answering the questions of the prosecutor and the defense honestly. In her final statement, she addressed the victim's family. "I cannot forgive myself for what I did. Rachel did not deserve to die. She was a young woman who wanted love. I understand that my jealousy and anger do not justify murder. I am prepared to take responsibility for my actions." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The court took into account the defendant's guilty plea, lack of criminal history, the circumstances of the case, and her psychological state. Judge Robert Clark sentenced Bridget Carlton to 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years. The court recognizes that the defendant acted under the influence of intense emotional distress, he said in sentencing. However, a human life has been lost, and that requires a just punishment. Bridget accepted the sentence without emotion. Her parents, who had traveled from Kansas City, wept in the courtroom. Eston was not present at the sentencing. At the Women's Correctional Facility in Topeka, Bridget became a model prisoner. She worked in the prison library, helped illiterate inmates learn to read, and participated in psychological rehabilitation programs. Psychologists noted her desire for atonement and her understanding of the seriousness of the crime she had committed. Eston sold the restaurant to pay off his debts and left Topeka. According to unconfirmed reports, he moved to California, where he works as a cook in a small family restaurant. The divorce was finalized in absentia 6 months after the sentence. Detective O'Connor, closing the case, wrote in his final report, "The murder of Rachel Morgan was the result of a classic love triangle, complicated by financial problems and a crisis in the marriage. All those involved in the events became victims of their own decisions and circumstances. The house on Huntridge Avenue was sold by the bank for mortgage debt. The new owners did a major renovation, but the neighbors still call it the murder house. The carpet in the living room was replaced, but the bloodstain remains forever in the memory of those who saw what happened." Rachel Morgan's family established a scholarship for young real estate agents at a local college. Thomas Morgan regularly visits his sister's grave at Mount Hope Cemetery and says he has forgiven Bridget Carlton, realizing that his sister was not blameless in the situation either. The case was covered in the local media as an example of how deception and infidelity can lead to tragic consequences. Family psychologists in Topeka noted an increase in requests for counseling after the Bridget Carlton trial. In December 2029, after serving 4 years and 8 months in prison, Bridget Carlton was released on parole for good behavior. She moved in with her parents in Kansas City and volunteered at a center for women who had experienced domestic violence. The Carlton case became part of the curriculum at the University of Kansas Law School as an example of the influence of psychological factors on the classification of a crime. Students study it in the context of the differences between premeditated murder and murder in the heat of passion. The story ended, like most real criminal cases, with no winners, only victims of circumstances and their own decisions. Rachel Morgan never found the love she was looking for. Eston Carlton lost both his family and his business. Bridget Carlton paid for a moment of rage with years of imprisonment and lifelong remorse.